Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our resumed series of Accuro remote training sessions. We went on a bit of a hiatus for a month or two on either side of New Year's. It was a very busy time of year for us, dealing with the Windows 7 end-of-life situation. But things have settled down a bit now, so we're back to working on the fun stuff, or at least what I think is fun. One small change that we're going to be making to these sessions is keeping them a little more focused on specific subjects within Accuro, and I'll try to keep them a little bit shorter too. So today we're going to touch on just a small part of a big subject, privacy and consent, and how we can record and display that information in Accuro. Now, there are some specific situations in which the patient doesn't need to provide consent to have their information shared. If you refer a patient to an orthopedic surgeon, and the surgeon's office faxes you to ask for a copy of the patient's latest knee MRI, you don't need to have explicit permission from the patient to release that. You can just go ahead and send it because the surgeon needs that report to be able to care properly for the patient. To share information with anybody else, though, you need the patient's consent. So, if a lawyer's office faxes you to ask for a copy of the same report, they need to include a signed statement from the patient saying, yes, it's okay for you to release that to my lawyer. But here's the tricky thing. Anybody else doesn't just include lawyers' offices or employers or other people that you would naturally assume that the patient wouldn't want you to share their information with. It also includes wives and husbands and parents and children and friends and neighbors, and even voicemail message systems. There have been times in the past when I've been filling in at an office I don't normally work for, and I've had the sweetest little old ladies call in to book appointments for themselves. And I've done it, and they've been just lovely and charming. And just as we're about to end the call, they say, oh, and could you tell me when my husband's next appointment is too? He always forgets, silly man that he is. We've been married for 47 years now, and he still wouldn't remember which leg to put into his pants first thing in the morning if I wasn't there to tell him. And I've checked the husband's chart, and I haven't seen any indication on it that he has consented to have his personal health information, which includes things like his appointment times, shared with anyone. And then I've apologetically told those darling little old ladies, I'm sorry, but it doesn't look like he's given us permission to share that information. And I've been sworn at by those delightful little old ladies plural, because this has happened more than once. And I've been called some very interesting things and have learned some very interesting words and have been told to perform some very interesting and physically improbable actions. And you might be thinking, hearing that story, that I was being ridiculous and that I should have just given her the information. She's his wife. They've been married for 47 years. Of course, she wants to know when his appointments are. But what if, instead of an elderly couple, it was a mother asking about her 18-year-old daughter, and the daughter was coming in the next day for something she might not want her mother to know about? Or, for that matter, what if it was that same elderly couple, and the husband had booked an appointment for himself to discuss his concerns about his wife, because lately she's been unusually irritable and paranoid and forgetful? And as problematic as it can be to share information with other people, sharing that information with a machine can be even worse, because we often don't know who else might have access to that machine. Even leaving a message for something as seemingly innocent as an appointment notification or a reminder can be a massive invasion of a patient's privacy. Maybe you're filling in at a GP psychotherapist's office, and you're doing the reminder calls for the next week. And even though the regular admin at the office knows to only ever call Jane on her cell phone, there's no indication of that written on her chart. So you call the home phone number, because it's the first one listed, and leave what you think is a very simple and harmless message. Hey, this is Dr. Demo's office, just calling to remind Jane of her appointment with us next Monday at 10 a.m. Well, if you left that message on Jane's home voicemail, and Jane's abusive husband gets home before her at the end of the day and always checks the messages first, and he Googles Dr. Demo Barry and sees that that particular doctor provides counseling services, and he thinks counseling is a bunch of touchy-feely junk and he doesn't approve of his wife seeing someone for that, that's that's a big problem. So, how can you avoid the risks and the potential legal and professional liability of oversharing patient information while also avoiding getting cursed out by little old ladies? Simple. Have your patients fill out a consent form which specifies what types of information they're comfortable sharing, who they're comfortable sharing it with, how much detail can be left in voicemail messages, and which phone numbers voicemail messages can be left on. I've seen a lot of offices use things like global messages for this. Okay to talk to mom about appointments, leave messages on cell, but that's not really a reliable way to record or display that information. For one thing, global messages can be seen by literally everyone who uses our system, which means that message is popping up at the walk-in clinics and at our FIT programs and at our specialist offices. So global messages should really only ever be used for information that everybody who interacts with that patient needs to see. More importantly, though, the old saying about verbal contracts is that they're only worth as much as the paper they were written on, which is to say, nothing. Having the patient fill out a written consent form is the best way to protect yourself and the physician or other healthcare provider and the other staff in your office from any accusations of breaching privacy by leaving inappropriate messages, because you have it right there, signed and dated and in the chart, that the patient said you could. Now, a lot of offices already have their own versions of consent forms, and if your office likes what you currently have, by all means continue to use it. I actually made one for my old office back in the day that I've now seen 3 additional extra offices put their own letterhead and start using, which is kind of flattering, and I also wish there was a way for me to get royalties out of it. But for offices that don't have their own consent form, or if you just want to make things a bit easier by being able to generate one right in Accuro, we now have a universal version that anybody can use. It's in the Forms dropdown, and I'm just going to load up one of our favorite test patients, good old Troy. And most people get to the Forms dropdown by clicking on the EMR section and waiting for that to load, and then going to Encounter Notes, and it's the big dropdown here. It is listed under Privacy, but if you don't feel like scrolling through 300 different versions of the Ministry of Health lab rec to get to it, you can just click in the template search field, type in the word privacy, and there it is, the telephone consent form. As with all of our current forms, it will automatically pull in the information for the current patient that you have loaded, and then you can just print it, hand it to the patient, have them fill it in, and then scan it into their chart. This form lets people be very clear about how their information is handled, and it removes any ambiguity or confusion. So, in this patient's chart, we have a consent form that was filled out by them and then scanned in. We filed this in a way that makes sense in our make-believe office here. So I use the type consent and then the subtype consent as well. But maybe in your office, you like the type document and then the subtype consent. Doesn't really matter. What you use is less important than making sure you're always using the same thing consistently to make these easier to find if you need to refer to them later. So the first thing we should do, now that we have this lovely consent form that's been all filled out, is use it to update Troy's patient demographics. I have the paper form sitting in front of me here, so I'm just going to refer to it rather than flipping back and forth all the time. And some of these demographic changes are going to be pretty straightforward. Troy has provided us with his preferred phone number, and he has specified that that is a work number. So we're going to enter his new work number here. 3. And we can use the drop-down to say that this is the number he would like us to call him on. He also left a different phone number, so we're going to update that as well. And even though his chart has a cell phone number listed on it, he didn't list a cell phone on the form that he filled out for us today. Maybe he had a cell phone in the past, but he changed it or got rid of it. And what he's telling us today in writing is that he only wants us to have 2 phone numbers on file for him. and anything else should be removed. Now, he also gave us the name and phone number of another person that he wants us to be able to leave messages with. Sometimes I've seen people put these alternate messages into the home or work field using the text box to describe what it actually is. So an elderly patient might have a work number called Sun Cell. But a better and more accurate way to do that is to click the little green plus sign beside the phone number field to add additional numbers with proper descriptions. Now, minor side note, we'd love it if, at some point in the future, QHR would update Accuro to rename the different phone number fields. A lot of patients don't actually have a home phone at this point. I don't, I just have a cell phone. And very few patients that I encountered in the office environment wanted us to have a work phone number on file for them. So QHR could just call them something like primary, secondary, and other. But until they do, we do recommend that you put things in as they're labeled. So if it's the patient's cell phone, put it in the cell field. And if you want to add additional phone numbers that are something other than home, work, or cell, do it here. So we can add the name and number of Troy's alternate contact here. And that's Helen. 10370. And in the notes field, we can put who it is. So now all of his information has been updated. We've got the correct phone numbers for him. We've got what number he prefers us to use. But where do we actually record his consent? You'll probably need to scroll down a little bit on the screen to see it. But we do have a field specifically for consents right in the patient demographics. We can use this box to write in a short summary of where and with whom we can leave messages for Troy. Now, there's no standard on how to phrase that consent. Different people in different offices like to record different levels of detail for things. There's no one right way to do it. It depends on how you want to record the information. Do you want to use short forms? Do you want to write things out? For something like Troy's form here, if I were working in an office, I would probably record it something like this. So, in other words, it's okay to leave messages for Troy, but only either on the work phone number listed for him or with Helen, and it's okay to share Troy's information with Helen. So now we have that consent recorded, but how do we make it visible in a way that lets us see it without having to come into the demographics tab of the patient section and then scrolling all the way down? Well, we can actually add it to our patient status bar. And to change the patient status bar, we click on the Accuro bullseye, and then go to File, and then User Preferences. And then a new window pops up, and we click on Display because we're changing how Accuro looks. And then we click on Display again. And here we have up to 2 lines that we can use to show information about the current patient. Now, by default, there's not a lot of information in these lines. By default, it just shows the patient's home phone number, and it doesn't show any other numbers for them, and it doesn't tell us which one they'd like us to use. And this is the default setting that new accounts start out with, and it's what a lot of people end up using in the office. And the default information is useful, but as with anything in Accuro that you can customize, you can make it more useful for yourself specifically. So the status bar has 2 different types of content in it. First, it has these codes, anything enclosed in the angled brackets, and those pull information directly out of the EMR. And secondly, it has some formatting written in to help identify what the different things are. So we have the word patient written out, then a colon, then a space. Then we have the code for the patient's last name, Pat last name. Then we have a comma written in, then a space, and then the code for the patient's first name. Putting those labels and spaces in is important, especially if you're going to add new things, because otherwise everything just runs together into a big old wad of unreadable text. Now, we're going to add a couple of things to the status bar. To do that, we're going to find the place on the status bar that we want to edit, and we're going to click there with the mouse, and then we're going to start typing. And what I want to start with is the phone numbers. By default, the status bar just shows the patient's home phone number. That's what PAT home phone means. But we also want to list their work and cell numbers, and we also want to label all of them so we know which is which. So we're going to label the home phone number just the same way the patient name is labeled. I'm going to click the mouse cursor in front of it, and then I'm going to write in home, and then a colon, and then a space, and then I'm going to have the PAT home phone code. And to add the work and cell numbers, I'm just going to click after the home phone code, and I'm going to put in a space, and then I'm going to put the word work, and then a colon, and then a space. And since we don't have the code here for the work phone, we need to pull it in by right-clicking where we want it to go, and then choosing it from the list. Now, it's patient information, so logically it should be under patient stuff. And there it is, PAT work phone. And now we're going to do the same thing for the cell, space, cell, colon, space. And then we're going to right click and we're going to pull in patient cell phone. And when we click apply, we're going to see a nice little perk of taking the time to set the patient's preferred phone number. That preferred phone number actually shows up in bold up at the top there. And if a patient doesn't have one of these phone numbers, there's just a blank spot there. One minor annoyance is that there's no way to have any other phone numbers show up in the status bar, but maybe QHR will add that in for us later. So now we have Troy's phone numbers all listed, and we even have his preferred number identified, but we still don't have an indication of whether or not we can leave messages for him. To do that, we can tell the patient status bar to pull in that consents field that we just filled out. I'm going to put this one on the second line so there's room for it. You can only fit so much information per line, and it depends on how big your screen is, and anything that doesn't fit just gets cut off. So right now we can actually see that the file number that should be showing up at the top isn't right now. We can still access it in other ways, but keep an eye on how much space you have to work with before you go crazy adding stuff. So I'm going to put this one on status bar line 2 because we have up to 2 lines that we can use. And we're going to follow the same steps. We're going to start by giving it a label. For this one, I'm going to use the word consent, and then a colon, and then a space. And then right-click and find the consents field. In this case, it's under patient, but then it's kind of hidden under these custom fields. PAT custom consents. So now, once we click apply, we can see that information right at the top of the screen. So we know what sort of messages we can leave for Troy, what numbers we can leave them at, and who we can share things like his appointment information with, and we can see all of that information as soon as we load the patient. So if we get an appointment notification for him for an MRI, or if he had some blood work done and we get his results back, without doing anything other than pulling him up in the system, we know how to effectively communicate that information to him in a way that both respects his privacy and that doesn't get us cursed out by Helen when she calls to ask when her forgetful husband's next appointment is. That concludes today's session on why telephone consent is important, how to access the new form we have for it in Accuro, where to record the information, and how to get it to show up in the patient status bar. As always, if you're watching from one of the offices we support in the Berrien Community Family Health Team or the Barrie Family Health Organization, and you have any follow-up questions, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. Our contact details are right in our Accuro address book. Just search for either IT department or support. When I post this video on YouTube, I'll also include a couple of pre-formatted lines of text in the video description that you can just copy and paste right into your Accuro user preferences, so you can get your own patient status bars looking just like the examples from today. And if you're watching from outside of our group, we appreciate you tuning in, and we hope you picked up some useful tips to share with your own team. This is the end of the recording, but I will stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any quick questions they want to type into the chat. Thank you for joining me today, and have a great weekend.